Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. The Surrealist movement in politics. The logic of Western civilizational self-destruction. Out Caesar. Ought nil world rule or total annihilation. While the autonomy of the liberal individual is demonstrated in contempt for dependence on political authority, the liberal's autonomy is limited by dependence on the ability to restrain the strongest. Conversely, Hitler's acceptance of the right of the stronger led to a logic of struggle wherein he had to be the strongest, both within the state and among other nations. Thus Hitler's conclusion that Germany will be a world power or nothing. This is a logic of completeness. One is either strong enough to be complete by being all victorious or complete by being all obliterated in a fiery Götterdämmerung. While this extremism appears alien to Anglo-Saxon pragmatism, the very notion of America as idea and progress that seeks completion or perfection hints at a core similarity with the Germans. If the Anglo-Saxons' world historical defeat in 1066 left them permanently alienated from political wholeness, then perhaps they swung towards the opposite extreme. Is not America irrational, bourgeois, Götterdämmerung in slow motion? The kin-selective irrationalism of the Anglo-Saxons, however, was never total. The attempt to destroy the Norman masters without destroying themselves was inherently problematic, since the Norman graft in England was partially successful, and the partial success of this experiment in aristocracy meant that the attempt to totally destroy the Norman yoke could not be fully separated from destroying themselves. Ethnic hostility against the Normans ultimately meant being against government, and against aristocracy, and for a morality of self-consistent individualism. The negative character of this anti-political attitude is directly related to the possibility of its universalization, because political identity became defined by the parameters of what one is against, not defining particulars of what one is for. Positive political identity became negatively defined through freedom from government. To attack the hereditary principles of the English ancient regime, the Anglo-Saxons were compelled to attack heredity in principle. If they were to be consistent in political principle, however, they had to deny themselves hereditary rule. The racial contradictions of America begin with Anglo-Saxons finding a means of superiority to the Normans in being above irrational kin group prejudice and preference. Superiority to Norman hierarchy through political equality elicited a precarious form of superiority, whereas acceptance of the old hierarchy was associated with Anglo-Saxon ethnic defeat. Does it therefore follow that radical equality equals radical Anglo-Saxon victory? Radical equality implied radical universalization and therefore the consummation of Anglo-Saxon defeat as a distinct ethnicity. The Normans defined their superiority, in part, in terms of superior civilization. The modern trick was to exploit this aristocratic civilizational inheritance by turning it against the Normans themselves and redefining in democratic terms. It is virtually impossible to understand the history of race relations in America without realizing that non-WASP immigrant groups often made themselves in an Anglo-Saxon image by turning against the Anglo-Saxons the same mechanisms that they had once used against the Normans. This historic background has been obscured by what may be the greatest Anglo-Saxon success story of all, the enlightened ethnic cleansing of Norman identity in modern times. The old Norman aristocracy would never have confused Anglo-Saxon with white, yet victimizing the Normans with cultural ethnic cleansing resulted in morally victimizing the victims of the Normans and indirectly equating the Anglo-Saxon race with all the imperialism and slavery of the English-speaking world. Is it so hard to imagine that the American dream of the underdog turning the tables on its oppressor might have something to do with the racial history of many of the founding underdog? Yet to fulfill the logic of table turning, The old Anglo-Saxon underdog must become underdog again as new immigrant groups fulfill the old revolutionary paradigm. Patrick Buchanan believed that the formula for Western suicide was concocted from the mixture of Jefferson's "all men are created equal" and Wilson's idea of self-determination. 1211. The rule of this ideological combination is really a product of the victory of Anglo-Saxon self-determination. In the American Civil War, the Norman Cavaliers that mastered the distinctive political development of the South would either rule at the top of the racial hierarchy or risk total collapse and equality with their former slaves. Slavery would exist to preserve the aristocratic Norman way of life, or the abolition of slavery would destroy that way of life. It was a gamble comparable to William the Conqueror's bid to master England or risk total defeat on English soil. Norman genius is manifest in the way that slavery forced the Anglo-Saxons of America to be bound to their Norman fate, whether they accepted or rejected the human inequality implicit in slavery. If the Anglo-Saxons accepted slavery, this would ultimately support the notion of racial hierarchy in which Normans believed they would lead as aristocratic race. If the Anglo-Saxons rejected slavery, their own bid for self-determination would, ironically, force them to confront the implications of their political egalitarianism. Slavery exposed the hypocrisy of the Anglo-Saxon nationalist interpretation of manifest destiny. Slavery forced the Anglo-Saxons to take their own egalitarianism seriously. Norman genius is evident in their very defeat in the American Civil War, while Neo-Puritan Anglo-Saxon nationalism in America culminated in a war to destroy the Norman yoke under Lincoln the Conqueror. Their very victory over the Normans meant that Anglo-Saxon racial nationalism 212 would culminate in racial equality with black slaves. The Normans would be a world power or nothing, but if they were to fall, the Anglo-Saxons, as a race, would be brought down with them. Chapter break. Tolerance for the divine right of kings. Opposing the election of Abraham Lincoln in February 1861, the New York Herald concluded that the Union was being torn apart, not by slavery, but by abolition, fanaticism, and Puritan supremacism. The fertile source of the ever-recurring mischief is the Puritan idea of the superiority of their sect over other men, and a mysterious divine right which they claim to possess of dictating to all mankind. 1213. In both the English Civil War and the American Civil War, Puritans and their Anglo-Saxon descendants were viewed as religious moralistic fanatics by the Norman Cavaliers. 1214. This point is imperative for understanding the connection between political scientist Samuel Huntington's thesis of the clash of civilizations and his argument for the Anglo-Protestant Puritan identity of the United States. In the West, Islamic extremism or fanaticism is commonly contrasted with the sober moderation of the West. This formula, however, is less than cogent when one realizes that the group that championed many of the most distinctly Western values was themselves accused of fanaticism precisely for fighting for those egalitarian values. If aggressive Northern anti-slavery abolitionism was an heir of Puritan religious fanaticism, and the victory of that fanaticism became secularized as Americanism, then the conflict between Islam and America may be traceable to two incompatible forms of fanaticism. It was precisely because Samuel Huntington was so conscious of the historically partisan or intolerant aspects of Puritan values that he was led towards a clash of civilizations understanding of America's relationship to the larger world. Puritanism did not subscribe to equal tolerance for the divine right of kings. It was characterized by fanatical hatred for the notion of the divine right of kings. This less than rational origin of post-Civil War American identity is what suggested an ultimate incongruity with Islam as the other fanaticism. To tolerate all cultures is possible only if one does not have a culture. Perhaps the deepest or most influential root of modern Western multiculturalism is the Norman destruction of Anglo-Saxon culture. Norman civilization did play some role in replacing Anglo-Saxon culture with a more rationalistic mode of discourse. Western political equality's slide towards cultural equality would thus have its most influential origin in the destruction of a distinct, native, Anglo-Saxon culture. The bourgeois Anglo-Saxon can believe that other cultures are equal to his own because his own culture is degenerate or dead. The mustard plants of multiculturalism have been fertilized by the decayed remains of individualistic universalism, whereas the universalism of Christianity helped cultivate the idea of a single human race. Multiculturalism is the admission of the failure of the practical realization of the ideal of a truly universal human civilization. Multiculturalism creeps back into a seemingly pagan tolerance, but is it pagan? Greco-Roman paganism tolerance was tolerance of diverse standards for diverse humans, and this meant, in the view of men such as Aristotle, that some are born to be slaves while others are born to be masters. Tolerance for caste and other forms of inequality would be the ultimate logic of a pagan multiculturalism. And this point only clarifies the influence of Christianity in promoting the idea of a single, universal human morality in the West. It is said that biblical monotheism is religiously intolerant, and while Greco-Roman paganism was tolerant, this cannot be a fair assessment until it accounts for the political intolerance of the Romans. A non-Roman god was usually easier to accept than the non-Roman ruler, yet Caesar Augustus was declared a god, and those who denied his ultimate godhood were crucified. Since politics was not separate from religion for the pagan Romans, the political intolerance of the Romans ultimately led to religious intolerance in form of persecution of those who would not accept Caesar as the highest political religious god. A moral legacy of Christianity is openness to fifth columns. Christianity originally was this fifth column in the pagan Roman Empire. Liberal democracy, inheriting this moral legacy, has carried on the fifth column tradition. Europe's latest Trojan horse is only another episode in vulnerability to the Semitic way of empire. By Western moral standards, feminism and egalitarianism are superior. By Islamic standards, feminism and egalitarianism are inferior. This clash of values illustrates the need to impose each other's standards upon one another so each can understand why the other is inferior in the other's eyes. Feminism is correlated with a generally lower birth rate. The unfolding logic of individualism, especially feminism's devaluation of women's evolutionary role as child-bearers, devalues kin-selected relationships in general. Muslims, who have resisted these values, consequently have the inverse demographics of population explosion. Thus, Muslims retain a competitive advantage by resisting Western values, even if detrimental in other respects. Western-centric universalism has been distinctly selective. While aspiring to learn from the best of all cultures, the West has formally rejected what it has recently considered the worst, i.e. patriarchalism, racism, and sexism. Insofar as the non-West does the same, they might judge the best to be science, technology, and some art, and yet reject what it considers the worst, i.e. moral decadence, egalitarianism, and short-sighted individualism. European countries colonized in their strength. In their decline, they themselves are colonized. White Americans, for example, can apologize for persecution of the Native Americans now that the natives have largely been defeated in the defense of their land. White Westerners can afford to be moral because this morality lives parasitically off the imperialistic sins of their ancestors. In a similar way, Europeans could afford to be moral vis-a gravis America at its imperial height because they too are still living off the sin of their ancestors' will to live. If America is an ethical giant, then Europe is like a little bird that craps on America's head. Islamic jihadists are the beneficiaries of a multiculturalism that is, in good part, a continuation of the success of Western intolerance for Nazi German culture. If tolerance is right, and intolerance for intolerance is right, then even this kind of hypocrisy is right. Liberal totalitarianism, the belief that liberalism is universally applicable to all human beings without exception, cannot help but be hypocritical. Belief in tolerance is itself a belief. It arose out the progress of logic of disbelief, and for this logic to continue its progress, it must become self-consistent and disbelieve in itself as a principle. In a truly tolerant democracy, one should be free to express belief in the holiness of jihad, or an active conviction in the divine right of kings. True tolerance means that 9/11 should be tolerated on the grounds of freedom of religious expression. Chapter break. Multiculturalism. Celebrations of nihilism. Perhaps the Surrealist movement in politics can be traced to a 2007 decision by a German judge named Christa Datswinter supporting multiculturalism over feminism or individual rights. She ruled against a Muslim woman who attempted to get a divorce while her Muslim husband had beaten her. The judge cited a passage in the Quran that sanctioned the physical abuse of Muslim wives. The judge thus created a legal precedent for the rule of Sharia law over Western constitutional law. Are Westerners to be tolerant of those practices that conflict with the principle of tolerance? The Surrealist movement in politics began with the imposition of Western ethical standards and notions of human rights on peoples who do not accept them themselves. Can Western standards be imposed upon people who affirm themselves as living refutations of its claims to universalism? Is Surrealism, as a political movement, a last stand of Western imperialism? The Surrealist movement in politics consists of surreal juxtapositions of liberal principles in the name of universalism and anti-liberal principles in the name of multiculturalism. Liberal tolerance of non-liberalism is premised upon the foundation, standards, and worldview of liberalism, not on non-liberal standards themselves. A last vestige of Western colonialism, liberal principles of tolerance and non-interference are impositions of postmodern liberalism upon non-Western cultures. It could be called empathy imperialism. The West defines and imposes the standards for what constitutes legitimate empathy, and what does not. Does the Western talk of rights and empathy for the oppressed really capture the beliefs, assumptions, and feelings of Islamic jihadists or Chinese nationalists? Or are these Western notions superficial by their very nature, a superficiality whose genealogy can be traced to the repression of the very particularistic origins of these Western notions? According to one variant of postmodern, liberal theory, all humans of all cultures are really Western liberals, with the possible exception of Western conservatives. Underneath it all, Islamic fundamentalists, for example, are really good liberals. The imposition of this kind of empathy imperialism represents a failure of empathy. Empathy on Western terms, advanced on the assumption that everyone is really a good Western liberal, represents a failure to fully empathize with jihadists who genuinely believe in righteousness of killing others in the name of Islam. There is too much order in all this diversity within limits. Diversity is compatible with a certain kind of order, but diversity can potentially increase to the point of entropy. Perhaps the next step in the logic of progress is the valuation of disorder, entropy, and anarchy itself. Prejudice against anarchy may be wrong. Perhaps anarchy is really the intended destination of progress itself. Multiculturalism would seem to strive towards the virtue of maximal incoherence. The quest for diversity means that the civilization that can preserve the maximum internal self-contradictions without disintegrating into new order wins. The civilization that can make coherent sense of itself loses. Multiculturalism implies a celebration of nihilism because it implies disbelief in the original liberal value of the individual over an ethnic or group culture. To celebrate all cultures, one must not have one without belief in something. One has no grounds to be against anything else. Tolerance is as a last gasp of liberal belief that lives on the cusp of nihilism. Tolerance is resolving differences by failing to resolve differences. It is a pragmatic peace for and by the diversity of incompatibilities. It promotes the demotion of the value of thinking through learning to not rationally question blatant contradictions. The United Nations is only liberal democracy writ large. The Western-centric idea of liberal universalism, i.e. the diplomatic strategy of the UN, evolved from the presumption that if people sit down and talk rationally, a common denominator of similarity or humanity will engender rational solutions to human problems. However, if reason cannot determine fundamental values, and reason, therefore, has no ultimate reason to culminate in humanism over its opposite, it is irrational to assume that this liberal theory is valid. In this way, the UN could become a means of asserting anti-liberal or anti-humanistic beliefs. I emphasize Islam here only for historical reasons, demographic reasons, and, above all, because Muslims have, on average, retained greater genuine belief in their religion than Christians and Jews. Among others, the argument here is not an argument against tolerance, it is an argument about the principle of tolerance. The question here is whether postmodern Western principles such as multiculturalism or tolerance, when pursued with ruthless Socratic logic, have any solid foundation or not. The unfolding of the logic of Western liberal rationalism exposes the faith underlying its original pretension to rationality. If Muslims find that the best the West has to offer is nihilistic decadence, a nihilism best expressed in the conclusion that the West, under egalitarian pretenses, cannot defend their way of life as superior, then the West cannot give Muslims sound reasons for adopting a way of life presumably founded on reason. A result could be surrealistic juxtapositions of the avant-garde of Western nihilism and Islamic fundamentalism. The virtue of the post-colonial West consists of directing the aggressive energy once united against non-Westerners, and channeling it against Westerners themselves as individuals and as a group. If the decisive superiority of the West is a more advanced state of nihilism, then the West is on course for rational self-destruction. The Westerners who want Muslims living in the West to assimilate want Muslims to become, like themselves, a people that have lost all sense of honor. The suicide bomber demonstrates a kind of superiority in overcoming the fear of death that terrorizes the bourgeoisie. For the West to simply reassert Enlightenment values in the face of radical Islam in a purely defensive manner, and without actual belief in its original rational pretensions, is the very definition of reaction and proof that the West is dead, living off the fossilized values of old. When unreasoned commitment to liberal values itself becomes a fully secular religion, this will truly be the death of the West. Islamic terrorists, these gadflies of unreason, provoke self-consciousness of the crisis of Western rationalism. If everything is reducible to culture, then this raises the possibility of the total failure of Western rationalism. Is there or is there not a fundamental, qualitative difference between the death of an Islamic suicide bomber and the death of Socrates? The philosophic crisis of the West is partly traceable to the paradoxical origins of Norman civilization. The Normans contributed to the value, the prestige of something they called civilization. The barbaric methods of the conquest ensured the supremacy of Norman appropriation of French notions of civilization, with its distinct cultural emphasis on social manners and refined taste. Yet, civilization could nonetheless amount to philosophical bankruptcy, as it did for Rousseau. But what is civilization? While civilization may appear to collapse into culture, it does have a distinct meaning that can be illustrated with a contrast with philosophy. I would define civilization as reason in the service of life, and philosophy as life in the service of reason. A rough contrast would be the Roman engineer versus the Greek philosopher. If Samuel Huntington is right, then modern Western values are not fundamentally rational, and there is no ultimate higher law in world history beyond the clash of civilizations. Yet there is a fatal flaw in Huntington's superficial understanding of civilization, and in that flaw lay the possibility of overcoming an all-too-human clash of civilizations. Chapter break. Cult or clash with civilization. At worst, I fear that spiritual entropy or an evaporation of the soul's boiling point is taking place, a fear that Nietzsche thought justified and made the center of all his thought. He argued that the spirit's bow was being unbent and risked being permanently unstrung. Its activity, he believed, comes from culture, and the decay of culture meant not only the decay of man in this culture, but the decay of man simply. This is the crisis he tried to face resolutely. The very existence of man, as a noble being, depended on him and on men like him. So he thought. He may not have been right, but his case looked stronger all the time. 1215. Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. All life is related. Chimpanzees and cucumbers shared a common ancestor extant millions of years ago. Life has evolved on Earth for about 4 billion years and, from that perspective, the socio-biological divergence that occurred between Germans and Anglo-Saxons in the year 1066 could appear as a minor notch on the cladogram of Earth's gargantuan tree of life. Such a macroevolutionary perspective, however, can also demonstrate that 1066 marks an unusually profound break in the evolutionary tree of biological life. Perhaps the best way to characterize this break is the conquest of civilization over culture. However subtle the shift may appear, ultimate human terms, from the 4 billion-year history of life's evolution on this planet, the Norman conquest represents a value revolution wherein civilization became valued over culture. Modern democratic revolution actually preserved this Norman contribution by turning the Normans' own valuation of civilization against them. The ultimate implication of this conquest of civilization over culture is the conquest of technology over biology. In The Clash of Civilizations, political scientist Samuel Huntington wrote, "A civilization is a cultural entity." Outside Germany, 19th-century German thinkers drew a sharp distinction between civilization, which involved mechanics, technology, and material factors, and culture, which involved values, ideals, and the higher intellectual, artistic, moral qualities of a society. This distinction has persisted in German thought but has not been accepted elsewhere. 1216. There is simply a fundamental disagreement here between Germany and the West. Huntington took his starting point by acknowledging that he, and presumably most non-Germans, simply disagrees with this German view. However, if there is no overriding human value universalism, this implies that Huntington's entire civilizational Weltanschauung must, in some way, reflect his particular culture or civilization. In Huntington's view, a civilization is a culture writ large. 1217. This implies that culture is the most intimate level of identity, while civilization marks the highest or furthest reaches of the boundaries of identity. Placed in historical context, this could mean that Huntington's culture was Anglo-Saxon, while the inclusion of a broader identity was formed by the partial success of assimilation to Norman civilization. This scenario was the product of the submission of Anglo-Saxon culture to Norman French civilization. Anglo-Saxon culture was ultimately dominated by the legacy of Norman civilization, while the furthest boundaries of Anglo-Saxon identity became defined by the boundaries of civilization that were implanted by Norman supremacy. While modern Anglo-Saxon culture is democratic, individualistic, and anti-government, the political viability of the anti-imperial empires of the English-speaking world was possible because rebellion was subsumed within an inordinately effective political framework inherited from the conquest of Norman civilization. The Germans were different from the Anglo-Saxons in that German culture penetrated into the very highest reaches of subjective consciousness so that there was literally nothing above it. While Anglo-Saxon rebellion against Norman civilization became institutionalized within the skeletal, re-engineered remains of Norman civilization, the wholehearted German rebellion against civilization produced world wars. Huntington was apparently able to relate to a German culture subjugated by Western civilization in 1945, but his civilizational Weltanschauung is incapable of understanding a rise of Nazism. Peter Viereck's Metapolitics, The Roots of the Nazi Mind, by contrast, may be the single best 20th-century study of the origins of the National Socialist movement precisely because it takes recognition of this fundamental antagonism between culture and civilization as its starting point. The difference between the supremacy of civilization in the English-speaking world and the supremacy of culture is illustrated by the contrast between Toynbee and Spengler. Spengler viewed a culture as a whole living organism, and this German view influenced his comprehension of every other culture. For Toynbee and Huntington, religion is paramount, and this is partially explainable through the legacy of the Puritan reinterpretation of the conquest's impact. In biblical moral terms, an absolutist interpretation of the meaning of cultural relativism is cultural egalitarianism. Cultural relativism, however, could just as easily turn into an argument for the supremacy of one culture relative to other cultures. Since cultural diversity can breed cultural antagonism, cultural relativism could lead to a defense of one's own culture against others. Whereas thinkers in Anglo-Saxon societies tend to view cultural relativism as an argument for tolerance, German thinkers have tended to arrive at the opposite conclusion. How can one explain this difference? The answer that makes the most sense historically is that the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of German culture was a historic failure. The value of cultural self-preservation was defeated in 1066, conquered by civilization, and ultimately replaced by a counter-civilization based on human rights. American universalism, for example, was made possible by the degeneration of an original Anglo-Saxon culture. This is a basic reason why the meaning of cultural relativism itself tends to be relative between Anglo-Saxons and Germans. Germans still had a whole culture to preserve. Huntington represented an apparent exception to this more general Anglo-Saxon trend. He saw no universal civilization and no universal destiny for all human beings, only clashes along the lines of the greatest differences. But does anyone have a better idea? Huntington failed to account that the Norman destruction of Anglo-Saxon culture is a key to explaining why Anglo-Saxons became early modernizers, especially relative to the Germans. The distinction between culture and civilization can be considered one of degree between two extremes: biology and technology. In a culture, biology predominates, while in civilization technology predominates. The English word culture actually reflects the degeneration of Anglo-Saxon culture and can be considered an ambiguous midpoint between the two extremes, colloquially, despite its formal association with the tabula rasa. Since Homo sapiens are storing biological beings, there cannot be an absolute distinction between the two extremes among humans, but the history of the Roman Empire demonstrates an example of a relative transition from an emphasis on culture to an emphasis on civilization. Both Roman and Islamic civilization evolved as a bridge of law over this and that culture. Civilization originally emerged from culture and gradually transcended its normative, kin-selected roots. But can there be civilization without culture? If humans do not destroy themselves first, the prospect of the technological singularity, the emergence of a greater-than-human intelligence, will gradually displace Huntington's clash of civilizations paradigm as the best model for understanding emerging human history. While the clash of civilizations will never be completely displaced so long as humans are, culture will diminish in importance as civilization, in the form of technology, emerges as an actor of mortal importance in human history. Perhaps the shift in historical tides will begin when unprecedented levels of unemployment, increased technological automation permanently displaces human workers. This would likely mark an acceleration of an ongoing process in which economic, technological, civilizational factors increasingly displace cultural factors. If people begin losing their jobs to machines on an unprecedented level, which will be more important, their culture or their economic existence? Here the German distinction between culture and civilization proves more profound, and ultimately more prescient, than Huntington's. His inability to sharply distinguish between culture and civilization reflects the conditions of the socio-biological cyborg of modern Western constitutionalism. Huntington's broader flaw was that he did not build on fully evolutionary, biological and technological foundation. The clash between culture and civilization represents the roots of a larger break between biology and technology. The culmination of this shift will be the technological singularity, the ultimate conquest of civilization over culture. Perhaps the clearest way to distinguish culture and civilization is through the difference between poetry and technology. Poetry is culture while technology is civilization, i.e. the internet. Culture can be sublimated in art or music, while technological civilization tends to disconnect reason from emotion or instinct. Culture tends to emerge from preconscious instincts, intuitions, and impulses, whereas civilization tends to either repress, overcome, or simply ignore these impulses. In general, culture cultivates biological nature, while civilization restrains biological nature. Culture exudes from the grain of nature, whereas civilization characteristically inhibits the grain of nature. Culture is interwoven with nature, while civilization attempts to stand above and control, manipulate, subdue, and domesticate nature. Culture suggests a pugilistic harmony with nature, while civilization incorporates the idea of man's domination over nature. Francophile Norman aristocrats, like the later Romans, but unlike Prussian Junkers, were more removed from the soil, more civilized above nature, more removed, in some ways, from even their own original Germanic or Aryan nature. The difference between the Nazis and Goethe is almost like the difference between cult and culture. At the root of the English word culture is cult, and it was this hard cult core of culture or culture that the Nazis sought to regenerate, i.e., when I hear the word cultor, I reach for my revolver. Cultor, however, emphasizes the cultivation of the highest peaks of the human mind by cultivating the nature of a garden with care, ripening, and refining of the values of the cult. Its fruits can be turned into the finest wine, just as winemaker ultimately values the wine, and not the immature garden's grapes in themselves. Goethe ultimately valued culture over the cult. Yet, in its own way, Nazism was a development of German culture that, however close it clung to this core, cannot be totally reduced to a cult. Why is Nazi culture almost automatically considered inferior in the English-speaking world? The unspoken belief in the similar inferiority of native Anglo-Saxon culture defeated in 1066 is so deeply ingrained that it has hardly been a subject of discussion without moralizing distortions. There was no deep philosophical discussion or formal argument against the rule of Anglo-Saxon culture in England in 1066. It was conquered. But perhaps something of the old Anglo-Saxon culture did survive into modern times in the form of a Nazi-like awe or respect for the power the Normans associated with civilization. The sheer mindlessness of the English-speaking world's belief in the superiority of civilization can be contrasted with reasoned critiques of civilization on the continent, i.e., Rousseau and Nietzsche. This unreasoned, thoughtless, English-speaking valuation of civilization as good can be traced to a Norman valuation of the supremacy of civilization, whose supremacy was imposed, not by force of philosophical reason, but by force of conquest. While England is not unique in this respect, this is nonetheless directly related to a traditional inability to evaluate the impact of the conquest rationally. It is also a root of the crisis of Western rationalism. The Anglo-Saxons of 1066 were inferior, in a classic Norman view, because they were less civilized. This implies that culture is inferior to civilization generally. Since Anglo-Saxon democracy ultimately conceded some belief in superiority of civilized government, the Nazis were ultimately judged inferior by the same standard of civilization. German culture had not been subdued by civilization. Anglo-Saxon culture was subdued, and a consequence was the puritanical alienation from nature, an alienation from the roots of culture that betrays the success of the Norman mastery of Anglo-Saxon nature. Yet because Anglo-Saxons measured themselves, not by a German valuation of culture, but by the supreme Norman valuation of civilization, they felt they could outdo the Normans only through superiority in civilization. The attempt to outdo the Normans in civilization helped found the modern, secularized counter-civilization premised on human rights, and this, in itself, further estranged Anglo-Saxons from their original culture. A culture, virtually by definition, tends to be closed or in some way insulated from the larger world. The Normans forcibly pried open Anglo-Saxon culture to the Latinate world just as the ancestors of the Normans in themselves opened up to the French West after settling in Normandy. While the Germans retained the closed conditions of their culture, civilization in the English-speaking world became associated with restraining residual ethnic conflict, i.e. the Norman-Saxon conflict. While culture tends to be characterized by a strong basis in natural instinct, this is very different from claiming that it is purely uninhibited instinct. The unity of desire and duty is what Kant called true, Kultur. 1218. Preconscious instincts disciplined by duty are what produced German social Überorganism culture. Like the genetically incorporated behavior of an antuberorganism, biological impulse tends to predominate. But this does not mean that biology totally dominates. The transition from culture to civilization is correlated with a transition from incorporation to symbolization. While a living culture is made possible by incorporation of the biological, social, and emergent customs into a larger, coherent social body, Civilization is characterized by reducing culture to information through the process of symbolization. Instead of living values incorporated into a way of being, culture becomes analyzed and symbolized into information that can be compared or contrasted with other information. The last stages of biological human civilization would thus be an information revolution wherein biology and culture are translated into information, i.e. a brain scanned, digitized, and transferred into a computer. As Huntington observed, the Germans tended to associate civilization with material factors such as mechanics and technology. The Nazi German reclamation of culture over civilization was also a valuation of biological evolution over economic technological evolution. While technological civilization began as reason in the service of biological life, civilizational rationality itself ultimately implicates the overcoming of biology itself. While the Germans, from one point of view, were prescient in viewing civilization way of death, from another point of view, death is a passageway to the possibility of seemingly endless post-biological life. There is some ground for viewing culture as more primitive than civilization. The ultimate consummation of this development will be when artificially intelligent machines, the pinnacles of human civilization, advanced to the point where biological humans and their cultures become obsolete. German culture is only primitive in comparison to Western civilization in the same sense that biological humans are primitive in comparison to the machines that are increasingly displacing them. In the completion of this trend towards artificial intelligence, there may be, not death, but God. The American or Anglo-Saxon yearning for culture primitivity expresses itself in the yearning for democracy itself, to never develop beyond the coarse mass to the human refinement represented by Norman French aristocracy. Yet this inhibition against human, biological aristocracy is nonetheless conducive to the capitalist-driven development toward a post-human aristocracy of technology. Below the superficial liberalism of Europe lies a deeper spiritual resistance to technological modernity itself, especially on the continent, which finds itself siding with the authentic poetry of Islamic peoples. A seemingly inevitable clash of civilizations fails to recognize the portents of a higher civilization in which Islam represents one of many paths towards a common end. Islam has not completed its evolution any more than the West has completed its evolution. The Western Enlightenment that appears to offer only freedom from a life of ultimate meaning may actually open the door to the ultimate identity of God in technology. The Islamic Enlightenment that appears to offer only freedom from Western rationalism may actually open the door to the ultimate identity of the singularity and to super-Islamic Messiah. Any people who turn their back on their native language and culture for the superior civilization of the West are following in the footsteps of the Vikings of Normandy. The Normans gave up very basic aspects of their culture to acquire distinctive elements of the heritage of Western civilization. Since the rise of Hitler represented the victory of culture over civilization, it was precisely for this reason that Nazism was incompatible with Normanism. It was the Normans who were ultimately responsible for decisively turning both the Anglo-Saxons and the Germans from culture to civilization, and thus, towards the technological genesis of God. Churchill was actually surprised that his victory against Hitler meant that he would be presiding over the unraveling of the British Empire. Although far-sighted in grasping the intentions of Hitler, Hitler was more far-sighted than Churchill in asserting that only his movement could avert the large-scale biological decline of Western populations. In the final analysis, then, could it be said that Hitler was more foresighted than Churchill? I do not think this is the case. It was Churchill who said, "The empires of the future are the empires of the mind." End of section.